My fiancée smiled at me across our kitchen table, still wearing the engagement ring I'd picked out 6 months ago, and said the words I'll never forget. Mark proposed to me yesterday at lunch, and I said yes. She said it the way you'd announce a promotion or a good test result, like she expected me to be happy for her growth as a person. I just stood there holding my overnight bag, still in my uniform, trying to figure out if I'd misunderstood something fundamental about how relationships work, or if I'd just spent 3 years with someone who thought monogamy was negotiable. She kept smiling, waiting for my reaction, and I realized she genuinely believed this was a mature conversation between adults. I'm Daniel, I'm 33, I fly regional routes out of Charlotte, and up until that moment I thought the most stressful part of my job was landing in crosswinds. I just finished a brutal 3-day rotation, the kind where you're awake at 4 in the morning in a hotel room and Tulsa wondering if the coffee maker is worth the effort, and all I wanted was to order something greasy and fall asleep on our couch. I always called Emily after landing, every single time, and she always picked up on the first ring, which is why I didn't think twice about the fact that she'd asked me what time I'd be home. She was waiting for me when I walked in, and she had that look people get when they've rehearsed something, that weird combination of nervous and determined that means you're about to hear something you don't want to hear. Emily sat down, folded her hands like we were in a business meeting, and told me she needed to be honest with me. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, she was 30, she was beautiful in that polished way that takes effort but doesn't look like it takes effort, and apparently she'd been having lunch with her ex-boyfriend for the past 2 months. She said it wasn't cheating because they were just talking, working through old feelings, being mature about complicated emotions. She said Mark had asked her to marry him yesterday, right there in the restaurant, and she'd said yes, because she realized she'd only been with me because I was stable and safe and convenient. She actually used the word settled, like it was a reasonable thing to say to someone you'd been planning a wedding with. She explained that she'd chosen passion over comfort, real love over just getting along, and she hoped I'd understand that she was following her heart. The whole time she talked, she had this expression like she was doing something brave, like this was her personal journey and I was just a chapter she'd outgrown. I asked her if she was seriously telling me this while wearing my ring. She looked down at her hand like she'd forgotten it was there, pulled it off, set it on the table between us, and said she wanted to do this the right way with honesty and respect. The thing that broke me wasn't the words, it was how calm she was about it, like she'd made a difficult decision and expected credit for handling it maturely. She sat there with her hands folded, looking at me with what I can only describe as gentle pity, like I was a puppy who'd just been told we weren't going to the park. I told her to leave. She looked offended, actually offended, like I was being unreasonable by not wanting to discuss this further. She stood up, grabbed her purse, walked to the door, then turned back and said something about hoping I'd eventually be happy for her, like I was supposed to work through my feelings and arrive at gratitude. She texted me 20 minutes later saying she knew this was hard, but she really hoped I could appreciate that she'd been honest instead of going behind my back. I stared at that message for probably 10 minutes, trying to understand the kind of person who thinks they deserve praise for blowing up someone's life efficiently. The audacity of asking for credit, for wanting me to thank her for destroying our future in the most direct way possible, made me wonder if I'd ever actually known her at all. I called my sister Rachel that night, woke her up even though it was past midnight, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said something I'll never forget. She said Emily didn't confess because she felt guilty. She confessed because she wanted permission. That hit me harder than anything because it was true. Emily hadn't come to me with remorse or shame. She'd come to me expecting understanding, maybe even approval. The next day her parents called me, both of them on speakerphone, and I thought maybe they were calling to apologize or at least acknowledge that their daughter had done something insane. Instead, her dad launched into this speech about how Emily had made a difficult choice and how they hoped I could respect that she'd followed her heart. Her mom chimed in saying that at least Emily hadn't cheated, that she'd been brave enough to be honest, and that I seemed to be taking this too personally. Too personally, like my fiancé leaving me for another man was something I should view objectively, like a new story happening to someone else. I asked how exactly I was supposed to take it, and her dad said these things happened and the mature thing would be to wish her well. I hung up without saying goodbye and sat there in my apartment wondering if I was losing my mind. If somehow I'd stumbled into an alternate universe where basic human decency didn't exist. For the first few days I kept thinking I'd done something wrong, that maybe I'd missed signs or failed her somehow, that maybe being a good boyfriend wasn't enough. I went to work, flew my routes, came home to an apartment that felt too quiet, and tried to figure out how someone could spend 3 years with you and call it settling. The word kept echoing in my head, settled, like I was a consolation prize she'd accepted while waiting for something better to come along. Chris, my co-pilot and closest friend, noticed I was off during a flight to Nashville, caught me staring at nothing during our descent checklist, and after we landed he cornered me in the crew room. I told him the short version and he just stared at me for a long moment before saying, "Brother, that's not normal. You know that's not normal, right?" It helped hearing someone confirm that I wasn't crazy for being devastated, that this wasn't just a normal breakup I was overreacting to. The worst part was how completely she'd rewritten our relationship in her head. Like every moment we'd shared was just her killing time until something better came along. I thought about the trip we'd taken to Asheville last fall, how she'd held my hand on the hiking trail and told me she couldn't wait to marry me, how she'd picked out flowers for a wedding that was apparently never going to happen. I wondered if she'd been lying then, or if she'd convinced herself it was true at the time, if maybe she was the kind of person who could feel something deeply in the moment, and then decide later it had never been real. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, kept replaying that conversation and trying to find the moment where I'd misunderstood who she was. Chris noticed how bad it was getting, told our supervisor I needed time off, basically forced me to take a week of personal leave. I spent those days in my apartment trying to understand what had just happened to my life, drinking too much coffee and scrolling through old photos like I could find some clue I'd missed. That's when I made the mistake of looking Mark up online. I found his LinkedIn first, saw that he worked at the same pharmaceutical company as Emily, which explained the convenient lunches, and then I moved to Facebook. Every single post featured his mother. And I mean every single one, birthdays and holidays and random weekdays, just him and his mom doing normal things that somehow felt deeply abnormal when you saw them all together. The comments were worse, all from her, things about her special boy and how proud she was and how nobody loved him like she did. He was 34 years old. I kept scrolling, looking for literally anything that wasn't about his mother, any evidence of an independent life, and I found a post from 2 weeks ago about his engagement. It didn't mention Emily by name, didn't have a photo of them together, just said he was starting a new chapter with a picture of him standing alone in front of a restaurant. I sat there staring at my phone, and that's when it really hit me. I hadn't just lost my fiancée to another man. I'd lost her to someone who apparently couldn't make a single decision without his mother's approval. I thought about calling Emily and asking if she knew what she was getting into, if she'd noticed the red flags that were visible from space. But then I remembered she'd called our 3 years together settling, and I figured she'd made her choice. She'd chosen passion over stability, excitement over safety, and apparently a man whose Facebook profile looked like a shrine to maternal devotion. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out just how catastrophic that choice really was. I spent the next few days in a fog, the kind where you go through the motions but nothing feels real. I'd wake up at my normal time, make coffee, then realize I had nowhere to be because Chris had basically put me on mandatory rest. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily sitting at that table, calmly explaining how she'd settled for me, and I jolt awake with my heart racing like I was in an emergency descent. My apartment felt different now, like every corner had a memory I didn't want anymore, the couch where we'd watched movies, the kitchen where she'd told me she was choosing someone else. Even the bedroom felt contaminated somehow. I'm trained not to panic when an engine fails, trained to run through checklists when everything's going wrong. But my brain had decided that the phrase settled was worth more attention than any actual emergency I'd ever faced. Chris showed up on the 4th day with takeout and refused to leave until I ate something, sat across from me at my kitchen table, and told me I looked like hell. I probably did. I hadn't shaved, barely showered, and I'd been wearing the same shirt for 2 days. He asked if I'd heard from Emily, and I told him about the text, the one asking me to appreciate her honesty, and he actually laughed, not a nice laugh. The kind of laugh that means someone's done something so ridiculous you can't even process it properly. He said I needed to stop torturing myself and start figuring out who I'd actually been engaged to because the Emily I'd described didn't match the woman who'd just blown up my life with a smile. That night, I went deeper into Mark's social media, and the more I looked, the worse it got. He lived exactly half a mile from his mother. I found that out from a post where he tagged his location as her house and mentioned popping over for dinner, which seemed to happen about 4 times a week. His emergency contact on his company profile was listed as his mother, not a spouse or sibling, his mother. There were photos of them at restaurants, at movies, at the grocery store, doing every single thing together like they were a couple instead of a parent and adult child. I found posts from his friends making jokes about it, gentle teasing about how he should update his relationship status to complicated with a photo of his mom, and he'd respond with laughing emojis like it was all just good fun. Then I found something that made me sit up straight. There were no posts about Emily, none, no announcement that he was engaged, no photos of them together, nothing that indicated he was in a relationship at all. The engagement post I'd seen earlier was just him alone, talking vaguely about new chapters, and when I checked the comments, his mother had written that she was so proud of her boy for making mature decisions. Not congratulations, not welcome to the family, just pride that he'd made a decision she apparently approved of. I screenshot everything, I don't know why, maybe I thought I'd need proof later that I wasn't making this up. The next morning I called Ethan, a friend from college who'd known Emily back then, someone I hadn't talked to in probably 2 years but who'd been around during her first relationship with Mark. I asked him what he remembered about them, and there was this long pause on the phone, the kind of pause that means you're about to hear something you won't like. He asked why I wanted to know, and I told him Emily had left me to go back to Mark, and he said one word no, like I just told him she was walking into traffic. Then he told me the story. Emily and Mark had dated 7 years ago, back when we were all in our 20s and still figuring out who we were. They'd been together for about 8 months, apparently serious, talking about moving in together, and then one day Mark just ended it. No warning, no discussion, just stopped answering her calls and blocked her number. Ethan said Emily had been devastated, spent weeks trying to understand what had happened, kept asking mutual friends what she'd done wrong. When someone finally got through to Mark, he said his mother didn't think they were compatible, and he needed to respect her judgment. His mother didn't think they were compatible. Emily had been ghosted because a 30-year-old man's mommy said no. Ethan said he'd always wondered if Emily had really moved on or if she'd just been waiting for another chance, and now he guessed he had his answer. I hung up and sat there trying to process what I just learned. Emily had left me for a man who dumped her because his mother told him to, a man who'd broken her heart so badly that her friends still remembered it 7 years later, and she thought this was choosing passion over settling. I felt sick, not just hurt anymore, but genuinely nauseous, because this meant she knew exactly who Mark was and had chosen him anyway. That afternoon I did something I'm not proud of. I drove past his mother's house. I didn't stop, didn't get out, just drove by slowly like I was looking for an address. It was a normal house in a normal neighborhood, nothing special, but there were 2 cars in the driveway, and one of them was the same model I'd seen in Mark's photos. At 2 in the afternoon on a weekday, he was at his mother's house. I kept driving, went home, and opened my laptop to look deeper. I found Margaret's Facebook, Mark's mother, and her profile was public, probably because she wanted everyone to see how proud she was of Mark. Every post was about him, every single one, baby photos and childhood stories and current updates about his life, like he was her entire personality. She posted about his job promotions, his hobbies, his opinions on movies, literally everything. There were posts about his previous relationships too, and I found one from 7 years ago, right around the time Ethan said they'd broken up, where she'd written something about how grateful she was that her son had the wisdom to recognize when someone wasn't right for their family. Our family, like she and Mark, were a unit, and everyone else was an outsider trying to get in. I found posts about other women too, girlfriends who'd apparently not lasted long, and Margaret always had something to say about why they weren't suitable, too career-focused, too independent, not family-oriented enough. Then I found something that made everything click into place. Margaret had posted about Mark's engagement, but it was weird, talking about how she'd finally approved of his choice, how this time he'd listened to her about what qualities mattered in a wife, how proud she was that he'd made the right decision. This time, like Emily, had been auditioned before and failed, and now she'd somehow passed whatever test Margaret had created. I realized that Mark hadn't proposed to Emily, not really. Margaret had approved Emily and Mark had followed orders, the same way he'd dumped her 7 years ago when Margaret disapproved. Emily thought she'd won him back, thought she'd been chosen, but really she'd just been accepted by the only person whose opinion Mark actually cared about. I sat there staring at my screen, and something shifted in my brain. I'd spent a week thinking I'd lost, thinking Emily had chosen someone better, but now I understood the truth. She hadn't upgraded, she'd volunteered for a nightmare, signed up to spend her life competing with a mother-in-law who saw her as property her son was acquiring with her permission. For a moment, I actually felt sorry for Emily, and then I remembered how she'd smiled while telling me she'd said yes to someone else. How she'd asked me to appreciate her honesty, how she'd called 3 years of my life settling. The pity disappeared fast. That's when I realized something else, something that made me pick up my phone. There was one person who didn't know the whole truth yet, one person who was making decisions based on incomplete information, and that person controlled everything in Mark's life. Margaret had approved Emily this time around, but she didn't know Emily had accepted Mark's proposal while still wearing my engagement ring, didn't know Emily had been planning a wedding with me just 2 months ago, didn't know her precious son was the other man in an overlap. I opened a new message and started typing, kept it simple, no emotions, just facts. I didn't ask for anything, didn't demand anything, just laid out exactly what had happened and when. I attached a screenshot of Emily's text about appreciating her honesty, proof that she'd been engaged to me while having lunch with her ex, proof that she'd still been wearing my ring when she'd said yes to Mark. Then I put my phone face down on the table and waited. I didn't know what would happen, didn't know if anything would happen, but I'd done exactly what Emily had done to me. I'd been honest. I sent the message to Margaret at 9 in the evening, then put my phone in a drawer and tried to sleep. I didn't expect an immediate response, figured maybe she'd ignore it or Mark would intercept it somehow, but I'd done what I needed to do, and now it was out of my hands. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize in a text from Chris asking if I'd done something insane because someone from Emily's company had been calling around asking what was going on. I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my phone to find out what had happened. Apparently, Margaret had driven to Emily's office first thing in the morning, walked straight past the reception desk, and found Emily at her cubicle. The whole floor heard everything. The screaming about lying and manipulation, about trying to trap her son, about being the kind of woman who overlapped relationships and expected to be rewarded for it. Security had to escort Margaret out, but not before she'd made sure everyone in that building knew exactly what Emily had done. Laura, a woman from Emily's office who I'd met at a company holiday party, sent me a message describing the whole scene. She still had my number from Emily's contact list, probably from when Emily was organizing the party last year. Laura said it was the most dramatic thing that had ever happened on their floor, and Emily had locked herself in a conference room afterward. She said Mark had shown up an hour later not to defend Emily or calm his mother down, but to do damage control on his own reputation. I wasn't there, didn't see any of it firsthand, but apparently the entire pharmaceutical sales division of their company had front row seats to Emily's life falling apart. My phone rang that afternoon, Emily's number, and I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was crying, actually crying for the first time through this entire thing, and she said she didn't understand what had happened. She said Mark had called her that morning and told her they were done, said his mother was right about her character, said he couldn't be with someone who'd overlap relationships like that. She kept saying it wasn't fair, that she'd been honest, that she'd done everything right. I asked her if Mark had used those exact words. My mother was right, and she went quiet. Then she said yes, and I could hear in her voice that she was finally understanding what she'd signed up for. She asked if we could talk, really talk, maybe figure things out, and I told her no. She'd made her choice, called our 3 years settling, humiliated me in front of her parents, and now she wanted to come back because her backup plan had exploded. I told her I hoped she'd eventually be happy, used her exact words from that night, and hung up. She tried calling back 6 times, sent messages saying she'd made a mistake, that she'd been confused, that what we had was real, and she'd thrown it away for nothing. After the 6th call, I blocked her number and went back to work. Chris bought me a drink after our next flight together, told me I looked better than I had in weeks, and asked what had changed. I told him I'd realized something important, that I hadn't lost Emily to someone better, I'd just avoided being chosen for a disaster. The story got around somehow, I think through Emily's co-workers, and over the next few weeks I heard updates I didn't ask for. Mark was already seeing someone new, a woman his mother had apparently introduced him to, someone more appropriate according to Margaret's standards. They were engaged within 3 weeks, which would have seemed insane, except by that point I understood Mark didn't make decisions, he just followed instructions. Emily's reputation at work was destroyed. Everyone knew she'd been engaged to one man, while having secret lunches with another, and the fact that it had blown up so publicly meant there was no way to spin it. She'd wanted passion and excitement, and instead she got humiliation and unemployment rumors. Rachel called to check on me one evening, asked if I felt guilty about sending that message to Margaret, and I thought about it honestly before answering. I told her I didn't, that I'd done exactly what Emily had done to me, been honest about an uncomfortable truth, let someone make decisions with complete information. Rachel laughed and said that was the most diplomatic way she'd ever heard someone describe revenge, and I told her it wasn't revenge, it was consequences. Emily had made choices, I'd made choices, and neither of us got to control what happened after that. I sold the engagement ring 2 months later, used the money to completely redo my bedroom, new mattress, new sheets, new everything. I went on a few dates, nothing serious, just reminders that there were women out there who didn't see relationships as additions for something better. I ran into Emily's mother at a grocery store about 3 months after everything had happened, and she looked at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. I nodded politely and kept walking, didn't give her the chance to tell me I'd taken things too personally or that I should have been more understanding. The thing about flying is that you learn pretty quickly how to handle emergencies. You train for every possible disaster until your response becomes automatic. You don't panic, you don't freeze, you just work the problem until you're either safe or you're not. That's what I'd done with Emily. Worked the problem, made the decisions I needed to make, and landed safely even if the approach had been rough. I thought about her sometimes, wondered if she'd figured out yet that Mark had never actually chosen her, that she'd been approved like a purchase his mother had signed off on. I wondered if she understood that the passion she'd been chasing was just the drama of trying to win over someone who'd already broken her heart once. Mostly, though, I didn't think about her at all. I flew my roots, came home to an apartment that felt like mine again, made plans with friends who hadn't asked me to appreciate being discarded. 6 months after Emily had sat at my kitchen table and announced she'd said yes to someone else, I was fine. Not heartbroken, not angry, just fine. I thought I was being replaced, that she'd found someone better and left me behind, but really she'd just volunteered for a life where she'd never be anyone's first choice. And I'd been honest enough to make sure everyone involved knew exactly what they were choosing. Emily wanted credit for her honesty, wanted me to appreciate that she'd told me the truth instead of sneaking around. So I'd given her the same courtesy, been honest with the one person who actually made the decisions in Mark's life, and let the truth do whatever it was going to do. Turns out honesty isn't always kind, but it's always fair. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.